coffee had gone lukewarm by the time I got around to drinking it, which was fine, because I hadn't made it for the taste. I made it because 6 o'clock had come and I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't sitting still. The flat is small. Second floor, Findorf, a street of plane trees and bicycles chained to iron railings and neighbors I know by their footsteps on the stairs rather than their faces. I've lived here 4 years. Plain furniture, because I never saw the point of anything else. A table, a chair, a bed, a window that looks down on the street and the tram line, and further off, the spire of a church I have never once entered. I stood at that window with the cup in my hand and watched a woman walk her dog past the bakery on the corner, and I thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill I have gotten very good at over the last 11 weeks. 11 weeks since the scan. 4 months since the doctor said the word, and then the other words after it, the ones about the brainstem and the ones about management rather than cure, delivered in that careful, level voice they must train into them, the voice for telling a man something he cannot do anything about. I have an appointment next week at the Klinikum Bremen Mitte, a follow-up, though follow-up is a strange word for it. There is nothing to follow up on that changes anything. I have not told anyone. Not a sister, because I have none. Not a friend, because that word has gotten thin over the years, worn down to almost nothing, the way a coin loses its face from being carried too long in the same pocket. There is no one whose evening would be different for knowing. I sat down at the kitchen table with the coffee and looked at it, really looked, for the first time in longer than I could say. Plain wood, pale from scrubbing, a little scarred along one edge where I'd set something hot down on it once, years ago, and never sanded it out. Nothing carved into it. I let it go the way I let most things go now. Set it down gently, the way you'd set down a glass you didn't want to hear break. Outside, the street lamp had come on. That time of year in Bremen, the light goes fast. 1 hour it's afternoon, and the next, the windows across the street are lit up yellow, and the sky has gone the color of a bruise healing. I got up and closed the curtain, more out of habit than cold, and stood there a moment with my hand still on the fabric, and I thought, not for the first time, and not with any particular weight to it, that I had spent 30 years arranging my life so that nothing in it required looking at too closely. The tumor had simply been the latest thing to go into that arrangement. I had decided somewhere in those 11 weeks, without quite deciding it out loud, that I would live the 4 months the same way I had lived the 30 years before them. Quietly, without disturbing anything. I sat back down. The coffee was properly cold now, and I drank it anyway, because it seemed wasteful not to, and because there is a particular kind of comfort in doing a small, ordinary thing correctly when the larger things have stopped being anything you can do correctly at all. The flat was quiet in the way it always is in the evening. The pipes settling somewhere behind the bathroom wall, a car passing 2 streets over, the tram bell sounding faint and far off like it belonged to someone else's life. I have gotten used to that quiet. I built it myself, over years, brick by brick, and now I live inside it the way another man might live inside a marriage or a job or a church. It asks nothing of me. It has never once asked me to explain myself. The phone rang. It sat on the table where I'd left it that morning, screen dark, and it rang the flat, ordinary ring I'd never bothered to change. And for a second I only looked at it, startled that anything had broken the silence at all. Nobody called this late. Nobody called at all, most weeks, unless it was the clinic confirming an appointment I already had written down. It rang a second time. I set the cup down on the table, on the plain wood, next to where nothing was carved, and I picked up the phone. Wagner? Yes. My name is Remy Schultz. I'm calling from the Hamburg Polizei, LKA Abteilung. Do you have a few minutes? It was not a question the way he said it. It had the shape of a question and none of the air. Yes, I said again. I'm calling about a Daryl Zimmerman. You may have known him as a former work associate. I had known him for 30 years as the man who stood beside me in a cold parking lot at 4 in the morning and did not say a word for 20 minutes. I said, "Yes, we work together." "He was found deceased 2 days ago in his apartment in Hamburg-Barmbek. Your name came up in his records, an old employer's file, early 90s. I'm following up with people who knew him." I sat down at the table because my legs decided that for me before I had decided anything myself. The cup I'd set down was still there, and past it the wood, plain. Nothing in it but the grain that was already there when I bought the table from a man in Walla who was moving to Spain. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it in the flat way a man means a true thing he has not yet let all the way in. "When did you last have contact with him?" "We worked together at a freight depot outside Bremerhaven, 1989. We lost touch sometime in the mid-90s. I haven't spoken to him in years." "Did he seem well to you back then? Any problems you were aware of? Financial, personal?" "No, he seemed normal. I didn't know of any problems." Every one of those was true, the way a stone is true. It told him the shape of a thing and nothing about what was underneath it. "Did you stay in Bremerhaven after that, or move around?" "I've lived in Bremen for a long time. I'm not sure that's relevant." "Just background," he said, and his voice did not change at all. The same even weight on every word, the voice of a man reading from a form he had filled out 1,000 times before. "We're required to ask." There was a pause on the line that in a normal conversation would have meant someone deciding to say goodbye. I had my thumb already moving toward the screen. "One more thing," Schultz said, "and this is a bit of an unusual question, so bear with me." He said it the way you'd announce you were going to ask if someone wanted sugar in their coffee. "Investigators found a symbol at the scene, carved, repeated in several places around the apartment, on the kitchen table, on the underside of a windowsill, on the back of a closet door. Did Mr. Zimmerman ever mention any interest in that kind of thing? Occult markings, Eastern European folk art, that sort of hobby?" The kitchen table, the windowsill, the back of a door, where a man puts his hand without thinking, over and over, in the dark, while nobody sees him do it. "No," I said. "I don't know anything about that." "All right. Thank you for your time, Mr. Wagner. If anything comes to mind, you have this number on your call log now." "Yes." "Have a good evening." The line went dead the way lines do now, without a click, just a silence that used to be a voice and isn't anymore. I set the phone down on the table, face up, and it lay there dark and ordinary. The same phone it had been an hour ago. I did not move for a while. The cup was still warm against my hand when I finally noticed I'd picked it up again, though I hadn't drunk from it. Daryl was dead. That was the first fact, plain enough that a stranger with a badge could say it to me over the phone in the same voice he'd used to read out a parking fine. Daryl Zimmerman, 57 years old, sitting somewhere in Hamburg-Barmbek with whatever was left of the life he'd built after the freight yard, and now he was a case number and a name in somebody's file, and a man I hadn't spoken to in over 20 years had just told me about it as a matter of routine background. But there was a second fact sitting directly on top of the first one, and it did not wait its turn. The symbol did not need a name for me to mean what it meant. Kitchen table, windowsill, the back of a door. I knew exactly what that looked like without having seen it, because I had stood 18 inches from a wall-covered floor to ceiling in the same shape, over and over, worn deep in places and barely there in others, 30 years ago, in a container that Daryl and I sealed back up and never spoke of again. I knew what it looked like when a man's hand does that without him choosing it. I had watched a hand that wasn't even attached to a living man do something close enough to it that I still, on certain nights, saw it when I closed my eyes. Daryl hadn't taken up a hobby in Eastern European folk art in his 50s. Daryl had been marked, the same way the container had been marked, and he was dead now with his own kitchen table carved up under his own hands, and nobody investigating it had the first idea what they were looking at. Whatever had put that mark into Daryl's furniture had needed 30 years to find him. It had used them. It had not been satisfied with the reroute we'd sent it on toward a yard in Rostock in the last cold days before Christmas, when the country on the other side of that fence was still coming apart. It had waited, and it had found the one man who had stood in that container with me. Which meant it had my name too. Daryl and I had opened that door together. We had stood in the parking lot together. Whatever had counted us that night had counted too. I sit at the table now with the cup gone cold in my hand and the phone lying dark where I set it, and I do not get up, because there is nowhere in this flat to go that changes either fact. Daryl is dead because of what we found in 1989, and whatever sent it has had 30 years and has not been idle, and I am sitting at a plain wooden table with nothing carved into it. Not yet. And I hold both of those things in my mind at once, and I do not put either one of them down. I got up eventually, because sitting there did not change anything, and there was one thing in the flat that might. The water heater in my bathroom is bolted to the wall the way everything in these old Findorf buildings is bolted, which is to say badly, and it comes away from the plaster with a groan if you pull it by the top edge and lean your weight back. I have done this in 4 apartments now. Hamburg first, then Bremen twice, then here. Each time I told myself I was checking for damp behind it, in case anyone ever asked. Nobody ever asked. The envelope was taped where I'd left it the last time, manila, gone soft and gray at the corners, the tape yellowed and brittle enough that it came away from the metal in flakes rather than a strip. I peeled it loose with 2 fingers and did not look at it right away. I set it on the closed lid of the toilet and pushed the water heater back against the wall. I carried it into the kitchen the way you'd carry something that might be wired to go off, and I set it on the table where the phone still lay dark and where my cup still sat with a skin forming on the cold coffee. I had never opened it. 30 years, 4 flats, and I had never once broken the seal, because as long as it stayed closed, I could tell myself it was just paper. That was the arrangement I'd made with myself in November of 1989, and I had kept it the way you keep the good half of a bad deal, without ever once being tempted to renegotiate. I opened it now. 2 Polaroids and a single sheet of paper, folded twice, my own handwriting on it faded to a thin brown. I laid the photographs face up first because the paper had waited 30 years. It could wait another minute. I'd had the disposable camera in my jacket pocket that night for no better reason than that I'd bought it 3 days earlier to take to Berlin, where everyone else at the depot had gone, where the wall had come down, and half the country's freight workers had apparently decided that watching history happen mattered more than logging discrepancies. I hadn't gone. I don't remember now why I hadn't gone. I remember that the depot was running with a skeleton crew that week, half the usual eyes on half the usual paperwork, which is exactly the kind of week you get assigned to clear a backlog of freight nobody has looked at properly, and exactly the kind of week when nobody notices 2 23-year-olds pulling the seal on a container that shouldn't have been on that yard at all. It had East German documentation riding on a West German manifest, shipped under a line called Nordsee Transit Handle that I looked up years later, out of some itch I couldn't leave alone, and found had dissolved in 1991 without so much as a liquidation notice. No offices, no employees anyone could name. Nothing. At the time, it was just a mismatch, a discrepancy, the kind of thing we were paid to log and move on from. We opened it because the paperwork didn't match. We were doing our jobs. The first Polaroid showed the chair. A plain wooden chair, the kind you'd find in any kitchen, bolted through the seat and through the base into the container floor at all 4 corners. Leather straps at the wrist and ankle positions, buckled tight. The second showed the man in it, and behind him, the wall. He was dead. No pulse when Daryl checked his wrist, no breath, his skin gone cold the way skin goes when a body has been without warmth for some time. He had been dead for a while, and he had not decomposed. Not a mark of it, not a smell. Nothing but a man sitting perfectly still in a chair with his eyes open. The wall behind him was the reason I'd taken the second photograph at all, because my hands were doing something my head hadn't caught up with yet. Floor to ceiling, every inch of the container's metal wall, scratched. Not painted, not stenciled with a template the way you'd expect if someone wanted to leave a mark efficiently. Scratched, the way you'd do it with a fingernail or the edge of a key. The same shape over and over, thousands of times. Some lines worn so deep they'd gone bright where the metal showed through. Others so faint you had to tilt the light to catch them at all. As if it had taken years. As if someone had done it the way another man might tap a pen against a desk without noticing, for a very long time. There is a thing Daryl and I never said to each other. Not that night. Not in the 30 years after it. When Daryl stepped to the left to get a better look at the restraint on the man's left wrist, the eyes moved. Not the head. Not the body. The eyes tracked him across the container the way a living man's eyes track someone walking past him. I saw it. I know Daryl saw it, because his whole body went still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Neither of us said a word. We sealed the door, and we stood out in the yard afterward, in November, in the cold, for 20 minutes without speaking. Two young men at a depot that already moved freight. Nobody wanted looked at too closely. And there is a version of that night where we call someone, and there is the version that actually happened, which is the one where Daryl finally said he could reroute it. A yard in Rostock. Webhafen Logistik, still running on East German paperwork while the whole system tried to figure out what to do with itself. A place where a container could simply stop existing on anyone's manifest, and no one would come looking. Not that month. Not that year. I said all right. That was the whole of my part in it. I said all right, and he made a call, and it was gone. Before he burned the original manifest he'd pulled off the container door, I copied it out by hand onto a single sheet, because some instinct in me even then didn't trust an arrangement that depended on nobody ever needing the paper again. I unfolded it now under the kitchen light. My handwriting, 23 years old and careful, listing an origin point I hadn't thought about in years. A facility outside Angermünde, in the German Democratic Republic as it still was that week, entered on the paperwork under a designation that translated near enough to Materials Archive. We never spoke about it again. Not once, not in passing, not drunk, not at either of the two funerals we both happened to attend for other men over the following decades. He went on working freight around Hamburg. I went on working freight around Bremen, and on a Sunday morning this October he was found in his kitchen, sitting in a chair, eyes open, hands folded in his lap, like a man waiting for someone to come and check the restraints. I set the two Polaroids down side by side and laid the handwritten sheet above them, and I looked at all three under the kitchen light, and I did not touch any of them again. 2 mornings later, I went down for the bread and found it on the door. The building has a heavy street door, dark green paint gone dull with 40 years of hands, and the mark was at the height of my own eyes, which meant whoever had done it had stood exactly where I was standing now to do it. Not carved deep, not the way Schultz described what they found in Daryl's kitchen. Thin, fast, a few strokes with something narrow, the point of a key, maybe, or a screwdriver, enough to break the paint and no more. Done in the time it takes to check that no one's watching and then not watch closely enough yourself. I did not touch it. I stood in the cold with my hand still on the door handle, and I looked at it the way you look at a word in a language you used to speak and have told yourself for 30 years you'd forgotten. I took out my phone and photographed it. Twice, once close and once with the door frame in the shot so there'd be no arguing later about where it was. Then I went and got my bread like a man does, and I did not tell the woman at the bakery counter anything was wrong, because there was nothing to tell her that would have come out as a sentence that made sense. I did not search it that morning. I want to say that plainly, because it matters to me that I know why. I had carried that shape in my head since I was 23 years old, without once typing it into anything, without once describing it to a doctor or a priest or the two women I'd been briefly married to, and there was a reason for that beyond simple caution. As long as I never looked it up, it belonged only to me and to Daryl, and to whatever was in that container, and it stayed a private thing, containable, something that had happened once in a cold yard outside Bremerhaven, and could go on having happened in the past tense. Looking it up would move it into the present. I understood, even standing there with a bag of rolls going cold in my hand, that a search bar was a door, and that some part of me had known for 30 years exactly where that door led, and had simply declined to walk up to it. But Daryl was dead with his eyes open and his hands folded, and now there was a mark on my own front door at the height of my own eyes, and a man does not get to keep declining forever. I opened my laptop that evening at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd laid out the Polaroids 2 nights before, though I'd put those back in the envelope by then, and the envelope was back behind the water heater, because some habits from 1989 do not leave a man just because the reason for them has changed shape. I drew the symbol as best I could from memory and from the photograph on my phone, dragged it into the search box with my thumb, and pressed the key before I could talk myself out of it a second time. Nothing, for the most part. A handful of clip art sites selling geometric line work to people who wanted tattoos, none of it close enough to matter. I refined it, tried variations on the angle, tried describing it in words instead of drawing it. Angular symbol repeated compulsively, Cold War East Germany, and on the 4th or 5th attempt, buried past the things that weren't it, one result came up that made me stop scrolling. It was a paper, a PDF link with a broken thumbnail, from a journal I had never heard of called the Baltische Studien, out of Greifswald, the kind of small regional journal that exists to keep a handful of retired professors occupied cataloging shipwrecks and border disputes nobody else cares about anymore. The title was in German, longer than it needed to be the way academic German titles always are. Zwangswiederholungsmarkierungen an Standorten der DDR-Isolationsforschung. Enforced repetition markings at sites of GDR isolation research. I read it twice before it settled into something I could hold in my head at once. The author was listed as Jasmine Schmidt, archivist. No institute, no university, no photograph, no line about where she'd studied or who she'd studied under, the kind of gap that in academic writing is usually filled in without anyone thinking twice about it, and here simply wasn't. It was published in 2003. The PDF link didn't resolve. It sent me instead to a page on the journal's own site that said the article was unavailable and gave no further explanation, no date, no note about a retraction, a placeholder, the kind of page you get when something used to be there and someone decided at some point that it shouldn't be anymore. But the search engine had cached enough of the original text to read most of it in fragments, and I sat there piecing it together the way you'd piece together a letter that had gone through a shredder and been taped back by someone in a hurry. It described the symbol appearing at several sites across the former East, all of them tied to facilities where subjects had been held in extended isolation, under something the paper called experimental sensory protocols, a phrase with all the color leached out of it, the kind of phrase a person chooses so they don't have to choose a worse one. It said survivors of these programs had been observed to reproduce the mark compulsively afterward, carving it, drawing it, scratching it into whatever surface happened to be near them, and that they appeared to do this without any awareness that they were doing it at all. The paper was careful, almost stubbornly careful, not to say whether this was a thing the mind did to itself under enough pressure, or a thing the mark did to the mind. It said the survivors themselves could not say. It said that twice, in slightly different words, as if the author had wanted to make sure no one skimmed past it. And then it stopped. No conclusion, no summation, no list of sources for whatever the final section had been building toward. The argument simply ran out of ground under it, the way a road runs out at a construction barrier with no detour sign, and the cached page ended there because, I understood now, the page itself had ended there. Someone had taken the last part of it away. I sat with that for a while, the kitchen lamp throwing its small circle of light over the laptop and nothing else. The rest of the flat dark the way it gets dark when you live alone and stop bothering with more than one bulb at a time. Then I found the journal's contact address, a general inbox for editorial correspondence, and I wrote a short email. I said I was researching a family matter connected to a facility in the former East, that I had come across Frau Schmidt's paper, and that I would be grateful for any current contact information the editorial office held for her, or a forwarding address if she was no longer affiliated with the journal in any way. I did not mention Daryl. I did not mention 1989. I read it over once, the way I read everything before I send it, checking that it gave nothing away that didn't need to be given. Clyde sends the email and sits back, the placeholder page still open on his screen. The reply came 3 days later, not from the journal's editorial address, but from a personal account, v.holst.archive@web.de. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee going cold beside the laptop, and I read it twice before I sat down. She wrote that she had been monitoring the journal's contact address for inquiries about that paper for 16 years. Not checked. Monitoring. It read less like an explanation than a light she'd kept burning for 16 years, waiting for someone to notice. She asked what I knew and how I had found the paper, plainly, as if she'd asked variations of the question enough times in her head that the polite version had worn off. I wrote back the minimum. I said I had encountered the symbol in a professional context in 1989 and that I had reason to believe it was connected to a recent death. I did not put Daryl's name in the email. I asked if we could speak by phone, and I gave her my number, and I sat there afterward with the feeling of having handed something across a table without knowing yet what I'd bought. She called that evening. I was at the kitchen table again, the same chair, the phone lighting up with a Lübeck number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, her voice came through careful and even. "This is Jasmine Schmidt," she said. "You emailed the journal." "Yes." "You said a recent death. I'd like you to tell me what happened. But first, I want to tell you what happened to me, so you understand why I'm asking." I said that was fine. She told it without hurrying. She had spent 2 years going through decommissioned Stasi facility records before she wrote the paper. 2 years of requests and dead ends and files that came back with pages missing, she said, though she didn't dwell on that part. The paper went out in 2003. Within 3 weeks, 2 men came to see her. They said they represented a private records firm, Archivdienst Norddeutschland GmbH, registered out of Rostock, and they told her to withdraw the article. "I refused," she said. "I want to be precise about that. I did not withdraw it. It was withdrawn anyway. The online copy disappeared from the journal's archive. The print run was small to begin with, and most of it simply went. The editor told me there had been a formatting error that required the piece to come down. I asked him what kind of error. He didn't answer that question. I have never gotten it reinstated." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't a question in it yet, and she wasn't waiting for me to fill the silence. "I kept working on it privately," she said, "without the affiliation, without anyone knowing I was still working on it. What I can tell you now is more than what was in the paper. The facility was at Angermunde. It operated from 1974 to 1988, under a unit that appears in internal documents only by a designation, Referat KS7. I don't know what the letters stood for. I've never found that written anywhere." "What did they do there?" "Sensory deprivation, prolonged, combined with exposure to a low-frequency tone below normal hearing, and the symbol. What they were trying to accomplish, I still don't fully understand. The records I have are incomplete, and where they aren't incomplete, They describe things in language that isn't the language of any science I recognize. I say that as someone who reads Stasi psychological files for a living. This isn't that. I thought of the wall behind the chair, the thousands of small cuts, and said nothing about it yet. What I can tell you, she went on, is what happens. Subjects who were exposed long enough began to reproduce the mark, compulsively, without appearing to know they were doing it, and people who spent extended time near those subjects began doing the same thing themselves. It propagates outward from the subject. I use the word propagates carefully. I don't have a better one. There was a man, I said. The last one. Held from 1981 until the facility closed in '88, she said, as if she'd been waiting for me to say it so she could finish her own sentence. Kept in a state I can't define for you. Restrained, in a chair, with the mark on every wall around him. I believe the restraints weren't there to hold a prisoner. I can't tell you with any certainty what they were for. The kitchen lamp threw its small circle over the table, and outside a car went by slow on the wet street, and I sat there with the phone against my ear and told her. I told her about the container, the misrouted paperwork on a shipment that had no business being on that manifest, the two of us cutting the seal because the discrepancy log said we had to. I told her what was inside it. The chair bolted through the floor, the man in it who was dead by every measure we knew how to check, and was not decomposing, whose eyes were open. I told her that when Daryl moved to look at the restraints, the eyes moved with him, and that neither of us said a word about it that night or any night after. I told her Daryl had rerouted the container to a holding yard outside Rostock because it could disappear there, and that it had. I told her Daryl was dead now, sitting in a kitchen chair in Hamburg with his hands folded and his eyes open, and that the police had found the symbol carved into his table, into a windowsill, into the back of a closet door. I told her about the mark on the front door of my building, thin and precise, at eye level, and that I'd photographed it before it could be painted over. She was quiet for a moment after that, long enough that I checked the screen to be sure the call was still connected. I don't know where the container ended up after '89, she said finally. I never had that piece, but I can tell you this. Archivdienst Norddeutschland GmbH had a Rostock address. I sat there with the phone still against my ear, and neither of us said anything else. And I understood that she had just handed me the other end of something I had been holding by myself for 30 years. I drove to Rostock the next morning with the radio off and the heater on low, and the address I'd copied by hand 30 years ago sat next to me on the passenger seat, the ink gone brown at the folds. The yard was still there, more or less. A new sign at the gate said, Hanseatische Lagerlogistik GmbH. No trace of the old name anywhere I could see, no sign that anything had ever been called VEB Hafen Logistik. Forklifts moved between stacked containers, back and forth, unhurried, a security gate at the entrance with a man in a booth who never once looked toward the road. I parked across from it, on a strip of gravel between two shuttered warehouses, and I did not go in. I sat there for 2 hours. Forklifts went back and forth. A truck came through the gate, was waved on, left 20 minutes later riding higher on its springs. Around 10:33 men came out into the yard on a break, stretching, one of them lighting a cigarette he didn't finish. 2 of them stood together talking. The third stood apart. A heavy-set man in a yellow vest, and he did something with his right hand that took me a moment to understand. Was not a nervous habit, but a rhythm. His fingernail moving over the back of his other hand, again and again, the same small motion, the whole length of the break. He never looked at his hand while he did it. He looked at nothing. I took out my phone and photographed him. When I zoomed in on the screen afterward, sitting there in the car with the engine off, I could see what his nail had been tracing into his own skin. It was not a scratch from anything. It was the mark, traced and retraced. The same lines, over and over, on the back of his hand, and he had gone back inside with the others when the break ended, and I don't think he knew he'd done it. I drove into the city after that and found a cafe on Krippeliner Strasse and sat with a coffee I didn't drink for 40 minutes. I drove back. The man was already on the hood of my car when I came around the corner of the warehouse. He was perhaps 60, gray jacket, hands resting in his lap. His eyes were open. He was not looking at anything in particular, not at me, not at the yard, not at the road. He did not move the whole time I stood there, 20 meters off, what felt like a long time, probably 10 seconds. He was simply there, upright, still, in exactly the posture Schultz had described to me over the phone without either of us using the word for it. Hands folded, eyes open. I did not go around to my side. I came at the car from the passenger door, opened it slow, got in across the seats without ever putting my back to him, and started the engine, and he had still not turned his head by the time I pulled out onto the road. 3 blocks on, I checked the mirror. Nothing. No man on the pavement, no man anywhere behind me, no one walking away in either direction. I checked it twice more before I let myself stop checking. I drove the whole way back to Bremen without the radio on. It was full dark by the time I pulled up outside my building. I sat there in the car with the engine off, watching my own front door from a safe distance before I let myself get out. Then I called Jasmine from the driver's seat, the phone against my ear, my breath fogging faintly on the inside of the windshield. I told her about the man on the hood of the car, the eyes that never once found me. She didn't answer right away. "There's a pattern in what I've been able to recover," she said finally. "Subjects who've been exposed long enough seem to stop needing to reproduce the mark actively. They pass a point. After that, they don't scratch it into anything anymore. They become something else, present, near people, waiting. I don't know if they're aware of what they're doing when it happens. I don't think they're suffering." A pause, longer than the others. "I'm not sure that makes it better." "Where's the container now?" I said. Not a question the way most people ask questions. I said it flat, the way Daryl used to say things because I needed it said and answered and nothing else around it. "I found it," she said. I didn't say anything. "Come to Lübeck," she said. "I want to show you what I have before either of us decides anything." I told her I would come. "Fleischhauerstrasse," she said, and gave me the number, 3rd floor, in the Altstadt. "Come in the morning." The drive to Lübeck took a little over an hour, and I spent most of it not thinking, which by then had become a skill I could produce on demand. The Altstadt streets were narrow and cobbled and empty at that hour, brick gables leaning over the car like they were listening. I found the number on Fleischhauerstrasse wedged between a shuttered bakery and a door that hadn't been painted since the wall came down, and I climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled of old plaster and somebody's coffee. Jasmine opened the door before I knocked. She was smaller than her voice on the phone had suggested, sharp-featured, gray-green eyes behind wire frames that made her look like she was always in the middle of reading something. She wore dark clothes, nothing that would stand out in a photograph. "Come in," she said. "Shoes off if you don't mind. The neighbor below hears everything." Her kitchen table was covered edge to edge with paper, and over the paper a sheet of glass, cut to size, holding everything flat. It was the kind of arrangement a person builds when they've stopped trusting drawers and folders when they want to be able to look at 15 years of work in one glance and never have to go looking for the piece they need. "Sit," she said, and I sat, and she stood across from me with her hands folded on the glass like she was about to deliver a verdict. "The facility at Angermünde closed in 1988, she said. "I want to tell you why, because it isn't in the paper, and it's the reason any of the rest of this matters." I said nothing. It wasn't a failure in the sense the ministry would have recognized as failure. The program did what it was built to do. What ended it was that the staff running it began reproducing the mark, not the subjects, the handlers. She tapped a fingernail against the glass, over a photocopied page dense with East German bureaucratic type. Men who were never inside the container for more than a few minutes at a time, doing their jobs, checking restraints, adjusting recording equipment. They started doing it without knowing they were doing it. On desks, on their own arms. One report, I have only a fragment of it, describes a supervisor finding it scratched into the inside of his own briefcase and not remembering when. And the records, I said. Classified at a level that should have meant they went to the Bundesarchive after reunification, with everything else the ministry kept. They didn't. Either they were destroyed, or someone arranged for them to look destroyed. I have built what I have out of what leaked around the edges of that. Through the Berthler Behörde, the federal office that holds the surviving Stasi files, filed under research pretexts that were not entirely honest. 15 years of asking for the wrong thing and hoping the right thing came back inside it. She lifted the glass at one corner and slid a single page out from underneath, careful with it the way you're careful with something you've already lost once. It was a photocopy of a photocopy, the type faint, a stamp in the corner half legible. This is the one that matters, she said. March of 1988. Written by a program handler identified only as Oberleutnant F. A rank, an initial, nothing else. I have never found his full name, and I no longer expect to. I read it. My German was good enough for the shape of it, if not every word. A clipped procedural hand, the kind of writing a man produces when he is documenting a fact he does not want to explain, only to record. The word Desynchronisierung appeared twice. Below it, a note that the chair's fixed bolted orientation, rotated a minimum of 45 degrees, disrupted what the memo called the transmission pattern. That's the whole of it, Jasmine said. No mechanism, no theory. He isn't telling anyone why it works. He's telling them that it works, the way you'd write down that turning a valve stops a leak. And you believe it. I believe a man under enough pressure to lose control of his own hands would not have written that down unless he had watched it happen. She let the page rest on the glass again, which is why I need to tell you where it is. She said it plainly, the way she'd said everything else. A private cold storage facility in Schwerin, on Wittenberger Strasse near the canal. A company called Keltischspeicher Westmecklenburg. The container had never been remanifested after 1989. It had simply sat, refrigerated for 30 years, in a basement nobody had reason to open. I found the man who manages the leases through a subcontractor list out of the Rostock yard, she said. I paid him for the file. He didn't ask why I wanted it, and I made sure he had no reason to remember my face. She reached into a drawer beneath the table and set a single brass key beside the memo. Not yet toward me, just set down. The way you'd set down something you'd been carrying so long it had stopped feeling heavy. It opens the gate to the storage corridor. I've had it for 4 months. I have not used it. Why not? Because I wasn't there in 1989, she said. I have never seen inside that container. I have a memo written by a man whose full name I don't know, describing a mechanism nobody understood, for a thing I have only ever read about secondhand. I was waiting for someone who could tell me the door I was about to open was the right door. My phone lit up on the table between us, face down, and buzzed once against the wood. I turned it over without thinking, and found a message from Schultz. Plain, procedural, the kind of message that reads like nothing until you read it twice. The task force handling Daryl's case had been expanded. Similar cases in 3 other states. A consulting body brought on under federal contract for Cold War materials assessment, Archivdienst Norddeutschland GmbH. I turned the phone so Jasmine could see it. She read it standing, very still, for longer than the message required. I didn't put this in the paper either, she said finally. I couldn't prove it in 2003, and I'm not certain I can prove it now. But I don't believe Archivdienst is investigating anything. I believe they're what's left of Referat KS7, the ones who survived closing the place down in '88, and who have spent 30 years finding people like your friend, like you, and studying what happens to them, learning how to move it, scale it. Daryl's death wasn't the mark finding him. I don't think so. I think Archivedienst decided he was a liability. She looked at me, and for the first time her careful voice had something under it. Which means you are also a liability, and a federal task force has access to police files, which means they have your name, from the call you took from Schultz, your address, your number. I sat with that for a moment, the way you sit with cold water before you decide whether to go in. You said you found where it is, I said. How do you know they haven't? Because if they had it, and they'd opened it, she said, the transmission wouldn't still be sitting in one place, contained, pointed only at whoever gets close. It would already be somewhere else. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. Outside, a bell somewhere down toward the harbor rang the hour and stopped. We leave tonight, she said. 11. Before they work out, you found anything at all. We didn't talk about what we would do if the memo was wrong, or what 45 degrees was actually supposed to accomplish, or what exactly we would be rotating a bolted chair away from. We didn't talk about what the man in that container had become, sitting 30 years in the cold with his eyes open. There didn't seem to be a way to ask it that either of us could answer. Jasmine slid the key an inch across the glass toward me. I picked it up. The A20 was empty in the way that only a motorway at midnight can be empty. Long stretches of nothing broken by the sodium glow of a service station, and then more nothing. Jasmine drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes fixed on the white line, and neither of us said what we were thinking, which was that we had a key and a bolt cutter and a memo written by a man identified only by a rank and an initial, and that this was what we were staking everything on. I watched the dark fields go by and did not ask her what happened if the bolts didn't shear, or if 45 degrees turned out to mean nothing at all. There didn't seem to be a version of that question that wouldn't just sit between us for the rest of the drive. We came off the motorway a little before 5 and followed the canal road into the industrial strip, past shuttered logistics yards and a scrapyard with a dog that didn't bother barking. The Keltischspeicher West Mecklenburg building was low and gray and unmarked. It didn't need a sign, because everyone who needed to find it already knew where it was. The main doors were chained. Jasmine led me around the side to a service gate set into the concrete, and the key she'd bought turned in the lock on the first try. Quiet, well-oiled, like it had been used before, by someone else recently. The corridor below smelled like a butcher's freezer, and old poured concrete, and the fluorescents came on one bank at a time as we walked, triggered by motion, so that we always seemed to be walking into a room that had been dark a second before. 4 degrees. I could feel it in my chest. The container was in the third bay, sitting on skids gone gray with frost rot, and the document sleeve on the door still held the same manifest I had copied out by hand in a break room 30 years ago, the ink gone brown, Nordsee transit handle printed along the top in a typeface nobody used anymore. I put my hand on the lever. "Clyde," Jasmine said, and nothing after that. I turned it anyway. The seal broke with a sound like a held breath let out all at once, a pressure equalizing, and the door swung, and the smell of the place came out at us, cold and metallic, and something else beneath it. Inside, nothing had moved in 30 years. The chair sat bolted where it had always sat. The man was in it, restrained at the wrists and ankles, and he looked exactly as he had looked the night Daryl and I stood in a different cold, and did not say anything to each other about his eyes. He had not decomposed. He had not changed. The walls around him were black with the symbol, scratched over and over into the metal, so dense in places it looked like a single wound. His eyes moved to me the instant the door opened. I told myself I was ready for that. I had seen it once already 30 years ago, and surviving it once is supposed to count for something. It didn't count for much. I stepped inside and became aware of a sound that wasn't quite a sound, a single note pitched somewhere below hearing, felt more than heard, a pressure behind the ears that built as I stood there. I put my hand out for the door frame to steady myself and found instead a short screw lying loose on the container floor. And I don't remember bending to pick it up. I only remember that it was already in my hand, and that the edge of it was against the wall, and that my hand was moving. Jasmine's fingers closed around my wrist and pulled hard, and I looked down, and there were 4 marks scratched into the paint next to 1,000 others, 4 repetitions of the symbol I had no memory of starting. I dropped the screw. She hauled me back until we were standing half in the doorway and half out, and neither of us said it, but we both understood it at the same moment. 30 years in the cold hadn't dulled whatever this was. It had only kept it in one place, waiting, and concentrated it there. Inside that container, the threshold wasn't hours. It was seconds. Jasmine had the bolt cutter and a cargo strap from the back seat of the Passat, and the memo said 45 degrees, minimum, off the bolted position, 4 bolts, 2 front and 2 rear, and we only needed 2 of them gone. She stepped fully inside with the cutter, and I felt the pressure behind my eyes double at once, my hand going for the wall again on its own account. And beside me, her left hand had started tapping against her own forearm, over and over, the same shape, and she didn't seem to know she was doing it. I caught her wrist and held it flat against her side. She worked the cutter one-handed on the first bolt, and it took 4 tries, the metal cold, stressed, and stubborn, before it gave with a crack that didn't do anything at all to the note in my skull. She moved to the second bolt. I kept her wrist in one hand and pressed my other hand flat against my own thigh and watched it the way you'd watch a dog you didn't trust. The bolt sheared. The chair rocked forward on its remaining anchors, loose now, no longer fixed to anything. We took the chair back together, one hand each on the wood, and turned it. He didn't resist. He didn't do anything at all. But the note behind my eyes spiked as the chair started to move, and my grip on Jasmine's wrist tightened without my telling it to, and we pushed the chair through the arc, 45 degrees more, until it caught and held on its broken bolts at the new angle. The note stopped. It didn't fade. It simply wasn't there anymore, and the silence after it was so complete it felt like its own kind of sound. His eyes lost their fix on me. Not closed, just still, the tracking gone out of them. And then they closed, and his shoulders went down inside the restraints, and he didn't fall. He only sat there differently than he had sat there a moment before, not waiting anymore. Finished. My hand came loose on its own. The screw was on the floor where I'd dropped it. The 4 marks I'd scratched were still in the paint, unfinished, but whatever had been pulling my hand toward finishing them had gone quiet along with everything else. The walls were still covered floor to ceiling in the symbol, still thousands of them, but they were just scratches in metal now, the way a scar is just a scar once the wound has closed. Jasmine looked at me and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything, because there wasn't anything yet that fit. We sealed the door. We walked back up the corridor, through the gate, out into the cold, and it was 5:20, and the canal lay flat and black beside the road with nothing moving on it. Jasmine took my right hand under the light of her phone and turned it over, checking the palm, the back, the wrist. There was nothing on the skin. Whatever I'd started had stayed on the wall. "You didn't reach it," she said, "or we stopped it before you did." She didn't say which she thought it was, and I didn't ask her to guess. We walked to the car without running, cutting along the service road that followed the canal instead of back through the front lot, and it was there, at the far end near the main gate, that I saw the dark blue BMW sitting with its lights off and 2 men in the front seats, watching the building the way we had been made to watch it. Neither of us said the name out loud. We got in the Passat and pulled out onto the service road, and I watched the rear window for 3 kilometers and saw nothing behind us at all. The service road brought us back onto the ring and then onto the A20, and for the first stretch, neither of us said anything at all. Jasmine drove with both hands on the wheel, gripping it tighter than the road demanded. The heater ticked. The dashboard clock read a little past 5, and the fields on either side were the flat black of Mecklenburg farmland at that hour. No lights, no other cars, just the two ruts of our headlights running out ahead of us and closing again behind. I kept my right hand palm down against my thigh, the way I'd pressed it there in the container, though there was no longer anything for it to do. Every few minutes I turned it over and looked at it under the passing glow of a road sign, and there was nothing there. And I turned it back down again and did it again a few minutes later. The sky started to lighten somewhere past Wittenberg, that thin gray that isn't dawn yet, but is the promise of it. The fields resolving out of the dark, one field at a time. Jasmine had the wipers going against a mist that wasn't quite rain. I watched the mirror out of habit longer than the 3 kilometers I'd promised myself. Nothing came up behind us. A truck passed us going the other way, its lights swinging across the inside of the car for a second, and that was the only other vehicle we saw for a long time. Jasmine spoke once, somewhere around Gettebusch, her eyes still on the road. "I don't know if it was enough," she said. "I don't know what enough would mean." I didn't answer her. There wasn't an answer I had that would have made either of us feel like we'd done something other than the one thing we'd managed to do, which was stop a chair from pointing the direction it had pointed for 30 years. Whether that was a door closing or a door catching for a moment before it swung back open, neither of us knew. We drove the rest of the way into Lübeck without the radio on. She dropped me at my car outside her building on Fleischhauerstrasse a little before 8, and I drove back to Bremen with the sun fully up by then. Ordinary traffic on an ordinary road, and I don't remember much of that drive at all. 2 days passed in my flat, and I didn't let myself say what I was waiting for. I made coffee I didn't finish. I sat by the window that looks down onto the street and watched people walk past who weren't looking for anything, who had no reason to scratch at the backs of their own hands. The phone rang on a Thursday afternoon, and I knew the number before I picked it up, because I'd saved it after the first call without quite deciding to. "Herr Wagner, Remy Schultz." "Yes." "I wanted to follow up on the Zimmerman matter." His voice had the same even register it had the first time, the tone of a man reading from something he'd read from before. "The task force has completed its review. The finding is a cardiac event, a pre-existing condition, undiagnosed. There's no indication of anything beyond that." I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and looked at the plain wood of my table, and I thought about a memo written by a man identified only by a rank and an initial, and about a warehouse basement 4 degrees above freezing, and I said nothing for a moment longer than was polite. "The case is closed," Schultz said, when I didn't fill the silence. "I want to thank you for your cooperation. It was helpful in establishing the background." "All right," I said. "Is there anything further you'd like to add? Anything that occurred to you since we spoke?" "No." "Then that concludes it from our side. Thank you again for your time, Herr Wagner." He didn't wait for me to say goodbye. The line went dead the way it had the first time, with the same clean, unhurried finality. A man closing a folder because the folder is finished, and there is another one on the desk. I stood holding the phone a second or two after the call had ended, listening to nothing. I set it down on the kitchen table, face up, screen already dark, and I sat there with my hands flat on either side of it and thought about the word closed. Not about Daryl in his chair with his hands folded, because I had already spent enough hours on that. About the word itself, and who had the authority to say it, and how a federal task force investigating a death connected to something they had no public name for had managed to reach a conclusion so quickly, so cleanly, in language that fit on one line of a form. It closed because the people who reviewed it were the same people the memo belonged to. Archivdienst had not investigated Daryl's death. Archivdienst had filed it. The waiting room at the Klinikum Bremen Mitte had the same posters it had 11 weeks ago, the same laminated diagrams of a brain sliced into cross-sections with a tumor rendered in a shade of red that no actual tumor is, and I sat under them for 20 minutes before they called me in. The oncologist was a younger man, careful with his hands, the kind of doctor who has learned to deliver bad news by softening the room around it rather than the news itself. He had my scans up on the monitor, and he turned them slightly toward me, out of habit more than expectation that I would understand what I was looking at. He said the growth had progressed within the range they'd projected. He said this as flatly as if reporting weather that had arrived exactly as forecast. He talked about palliative management, about what the coming weeks might look like, about a nurse who could come to the flat, about medication adjustments. He asked if I had questions. I said no. He asked if there was anyone I wanted him to speak with, a family member, someone to help coordinate care. I said no to that too. He nodded, unsurprised, as though he'd been refused before. He said the 4 months remained, roughly, the working estimate, and that it could go either way by some margin, and that he would see me again in 3 weeks unless something changed sooner. I said thank you. I did not tell him about the corridor in Schwerin smelling of refrigerant, or the chair, or the sound that wasn't a sound. There was no version of that sentence that fit inside the room we were sitting in. I drove home with the radio off. That evening I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and I wrote it all down, start to finish. The way you'd write instructions for someone who'd have to do the job after you and couldn't ask you anything once you'd started. The manifest and its false line for Nordsee transit handle, the Polaroids and what was in them, Angermunde and the years it ran and the unit's designation, the letters and the number I'd learned to say without hesitating. The Rostock yard that used to be VEB Hafen Logistik and was Hanseatische Lager Logistik now, forklifts moving in a lot where a container had once sat waiting for someone to stop looking for it. Archivdienst, Norddeutschland GmbH, its registered address, its federal contract, the shape of what it actually was underneath the contract, the warehouse on Wittenberger Strasse. The memo, word for word as Jasmine had read it to me. Desynchronization, 45 degrees. No explanation given because the men who wrote it hadn't had one either. What we did with the bolt cutter and the strap. What happened when the chair turned. I wrote it plainly, the way I'd have logged a discrepancy on a manifest 30 years ago. I found a large envelope in the drawer under the phone, the kind meant for documents rather than letters, and I folded the pages into it along with copies I made at the shop on Ottersberger Strasse, running each sheet through twice so there'd be no single original anyone could lose or take. I wrote her address from memory, Fleischhauer Strasse, the building, the floor, and under it I wrote a short note by hand. Make copies. Keep them in more than one place. Don't keep them all with you. I sealed it and walked it to the postbox on the corner myself rather than leaving it for the carrier, and I stood there a moment after it had gone through the slot, my hands feeling strangely empty. I didn't hear anything back that day, and I hadn't expected to. It was after 10 when I went into the bathroom to wash up before bed. The water ran cold first, the way it always did in that flat, and I let it warm while I looked at nothing in particular. At the grout between the tiles, at the small rust stain under the tap that had been there since I moved in. I worked the soap into my hands the way I always had, without thinking about it, and when I turned my left wrist to rinse it, I saw the mark. It was on the inside, just below where the veins show through, faint, thin-lined, the kind of mark you'd miss entirely under a watch strap or a cuff. It wasn't ink. It had the brownish, matte look of something dried rather than drawn, and I knew, without needing to hold it closer to the light, what it was before I let myself finish looking at it. 4 of them. 4 small repetitions of the same angular shape, the same count as what I'd left scratched into the paint of the container wall without knowing I'd started. I did not remember making it. I turned my wrist under the water. The mark didn't move and didn't lighten. I stood there with the tap running past my hand longer than it needed to, wondering whether it had been there before Schwerin, whether I'd simply never looked, in 30 years, at the underside of my own wrist. I didn't have an answer, and I understood, standing there, that I wasn't going to get one by looking harder. I shut off the water. I dried my hands on the towel behind the door, working it carefully around the wrist, and I pulled my sleeve down over the mark and buttoned the cuff, and I did not look at it again. I went to the kitchen, and I didn't turn the light on. I sat at the table in the dark the way I had the night Schultz first called, hands flat on the wood, the envelope already gone, already somewhere between Bremen and Lübeck in a mail van, out of my hands now in every sense that mattered. I told myself I wasn't going to think about the man in the chair, his eyes closed now instead of open, or about whether 45 degrees had ended something or only interrupted it for as long as the chair stayed turned. I told myself that, and I sat there in the dark not thinking about it. And for a while, mostly, I didn't.